The pristine white tiles of the Mount Sinai VIP surgical wing were never meant to be stained with the blood of a kingpin. Zora Sterling stood in the center of the darkened operating room 4, the rhythmic hiss-click of the ventilator the only sound against the backdrop of distant, screaming sirens. She was scrubbed in, her hands steady, but she wasn't waiting for a surgical team. She was waiting for the man who had just collapsed through the service entrance, clutching a side that was leaking crimson onto his custom-tailored charcoal suit. Dae-Hyun Park, the man who had supposedly retired from the underworld to become a tech saint, looked less like a god and more like a ghost. His eyes, usually sharp enough to cut glass, were unfocused and glazed with pain. As Zora caught him, the sheer weight of his muscular frame nearly sent them both to the floor. "I told you," Dae-Hyun gasped, his voice a jagged rasp that tore through the sterile air. "I told you to forget. My name, Zora." "Shut up and breathe, Dae-Hyun," Zora hissed, her professional mask cracking as she ripped open his silk shirt, exposing the intricate dragon ink now slick with blood. Her fingers flew to the specific nerve cluster on his abdomen, the secret spot she had spent months healing. Only now it wasn't just a site of old trauma, it was the entry point for a high-caliber round. She pressed her palm against the wound, the heat of his blood soaking through her surgical gloves. Outside, the heavy thud of combat boots echoed in the hallway. The Elder Council hadn't just sent a message, they had sent a cleanup crew. "They're coming for the ledger," Dae-Hyun whispered, his hand catching her wrist with a strength that shouldn't have been possible. "It's inside you, Zora, the research. The chip. They'll kill you to get it." Zora looked at the door, then back at the man she had brought back from the brink of death once before. She leaned down, her forehead pressing against his. "5 years ago, I taught you how to feel again," she whispered fiercely. "Today, I'm going to teach you how to survive. Please don't stop fighting. Because if you die, the dragon dies with you, and I'm not ready to let go yet." As the handle of the OR door began to turn, Zora didn't reach for a scalpel to heal. She reached for the emergency lockout lever, her eyes turning from a nurse's mercy to a protector's rage. The healing was over. The war had begun. Welcome back to the channel, besties. Before we dive into the story, if you are new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Now let's proceed with the story. The transition from the blood-slicked concrete of Seoul to the glass and steel serenity of Manhattan was supposed to be the end of the nightmare. For 6 months, life had been a series of quiet triumphs. Zora Sterling had established her private neurospecialist clinic in a limestone townhouse on the Upper East Side, her reputation as the woman who healed the glacier of Seoul, bringing her an influx of elite, high-paying clientele. Beside her, Dae-Hyun Park had successfully pivoted into the role of a tech philanthropist, his sharp edges softened by the expensive sweaters and the domestic peace of their shared penthouse overlooking Central Park. But peace, Zora was beginning to realize, was a fragile commodity for a man who had once been a dragon. The first sign of the shift was subtle, a phantom itch in the back of her mind that she couldn't quite scratch. It started on Monday with her 10 o'clock appointment. The patient was a man named Mr. O, a middle-aged executive who complained of chronic nerve pain in his shoulder. He sat on her examination table, his posture too rigid, his eyes scanning the room with a clinical precision that had nothing to do with medical anxiety. When Zora reached out to test his reflexes, she noticed the faint, jagged scar on his forearm, the kind of mark left by a tactical knife, not a kitchen accident. He didn't flinch when she applied pressure, he simply watched the door. On Wednesday, a shipping magnate from Blasian arrived with a supposed spinal tremor. As Zora reviewed his MRI, she realized the man wasn't listening to her diagnosis. Instead, he was staring at the reflection of the hallway in the polished chrome of her desk lamp. When her assistant, a bubbly girl named Sarah, entered the room, the man's hand went instinctively to the small of his back, a movement so practiced and lethal that Zora's heart skipped a beat. It was the draw of a man reaching for a holster that wasn't there. By Friday, the air in the clinic felt heavy, charged with a static that Zora recognized all too well from the darkened hallways of Dae-Hyun's Seoul fortress. Her final patient of the day was a young man with a shaved head and a tailored suit that couldn't quite hide the bulk of his shoulders. He claimed to have migraines, but when Zora asked him to track her light with his eyes, he didn't focus on the beam. He focused on the window, his pupils dilating as a black SUV idled at the curb outside. "Is there something outside more interesting than my exam, Mr. Kang?" Zora asked, her voice cool, though her pulse was hammering against her ribs. The man looked at her, his expression a blank mask of professional indifference. "New York is a dangerous city, Dr. Sterling. It is important to know who is watching the exits." Zora finished the exam in a blur of mechanical efficiency. After he left, she stood in her darkened office, the city lights beginning to flicker to life outside. She looked at her schedule for the week. 6 patients, all of them Korean, all of them physically fit, hyper-aware, and bearing the invisible marks of soldiers. They weren't patients seeking a cure, they were sentries providing a perimeter. She wasn't just a doctor anymore. Her clinic had been turned into a safe house, and her patients were a rotating guard of lookouts for the Seoul Syndicate. The ghost dragon hadn't just moved to New York. He had brought the underworld with him, tucked neatly into the shadows of her professional life. Zora grabbed her coat, her hands trembling as she locked the heavy oak doors of the clinic. As she stepped onto the sidewalk, she noticed the same black SUV from earlier. The driver didn't look away when she stared. He simply nodded, a sign of respect or perhaps a warning. She hailed a cab, her mind racing. Dae-Hyun had promised her that the violence was over. He had promised that they were legitimate. But as the taxi pulled away, she saw 2 other cars pull out of their parking spots to follow her. The healing was a lie. The New York ghost was still a kingpin, and Zora realized with a sickening jolt that she wasn't just his partner. She was the most valuable asset in a war that had never actually ended. The heavy thud of Zora's shoulder against the marble kitchen island was a stupid, domestic accident, the kind of clumsy stumble that only happens when your mind is 3 blocks away. She had been reaching for a wine glass, her thoughts still tangled in the suspicious eyes of Mr. Kang, when her silk slipper lost its grip. The pain was sharp, a white-hot spike that radiated from her collarbone down to her ribs. "Zora!" Dae-Hyun was across the room in a blurred streak of motion, his hands hovering over her with that frantic, terrifying tenderness he only showed when she was hurt. "Don't move. Let me see." "I'm fine, Dae-Hyun. It's just a bruise," she gasped, waving him off as she clutched her shoulder. But as the night wore on, the dull ache sharpened into something more sinister, a grinding sensation that suggested a hairline fracture. By midnight, with Dae-Hyun finally asleep and the penthouse bathed in the rhythmic pulse of the city's neon, Zora couldn't take it. As a doctor, the uncertainty was worse than the pain. She dressed quietly, slipped out past the security detail in the lobby who didn't even blink at her 1:00 a.m. departure, and drove herself to her clinic. She didn't need a technician. She knew how to calibrate her own equipment. The clinic was silent, the air smelling of ozone and lavender. Zora stepped behind the lead-lined shield of her private imaging suite and positioned the X-ray arm over her left clavicle. She pressed the trigger. The machine hummed, a brief burst of invisible energy passing through her skin, and the digital monitor flickered to life. Zora leaned in to examine the bone structure, looking for the telltale shadow of a break. She found it, a minor stress fracture, but her breath caught for an entirely different reason. Located just beneath her collarbone, nestled in the soft tissue near the brachial plexus, was an object that shouldn't have been there. It was microscopic, a tiny, rectangular sliver of high-density synthetic material that glowed with a distinct, unnatural sharpness on the scan. It was microencapsulated, shaped like a grain of rice, and shielded in a way that would make it invisible to standard airport scanners. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the hollow silence of the room. She remembered her own surgery 6 months ago, the emergency procedure to remove shrapnel after the White Tiger Syndicate's last desperate attack in Seoul. Dae-Hyun had insisted on his private medical team. He had been there when she went under the anesthesia. He had held her hand until the darkness took her. He hadn't just saved her, he had used her. She zoomed in on the image, her hands trembling so violently she had to grip the edge of the desk. This was no medical device. This was the ledger. The fabled digital vault containing the offshore accounts, the political bribes, and the true identities of every council member in Asia. It was the secret spot evolved, a biological key hidden in the one person the world would never think to search. The realization felt like a physical violation. The man who had whispered that she was his sanctuary had turned her body into a safety deposit box for his sins. He hadn't just brought the underworld to New York, he had sewn it into her very marrow. "You promised," she whispered to the empty room, her voice breaking. "You promised no more secrets." She stared at the screen, the glowing chip looking like a parasite on her skeletal frame. The lookouts at her clinic, the black SUVs, the patients with tactical scars, they weren't there to protect a retired boss. They were there to protect the hardware. They were guarding her like a piece of equipment. A soft click echoed from the front of the clinic. The heavy oak doors had opened. Zora froze, her eyes darting to the security monitor. A shadow moved across the lobby, not the hurried, heavy gait of a thief, but the silent, predatory glide of a man who knew exactly where he was going. She reached for the power button on the X-ray monitor, plunging the room into darkness just as the handle to the imaging suite began to turn. In the shadows, the tiny fracture in her bone seemed to throb in time with the betrayal in her heart. The healer had been marked by the dragon, and the price of his protection was her own autonomy. The betrayal felt heavier than the chip in her bone as Zora slipped back into the penthouse, the silence of the luxury apartment now feeling like the interior of a gilded cage. She found Dae-Hyun standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his silhouette a dark rift against the sparkling New York skyline. He didn't turn around. He didn't have to. "You went to the clinic," he said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to rattle the glass. "I went to get an X-ray," Zora replied, her voice trembling with a cold, sharp fury. "Imagine my surprise, Dae-Hyun, when I found out I'm carrying more than just a fracture. I found your secret spot. Only this time, it's digital." Dae-Hyun turned, his expression a mask of tortured stoicism. "Zora, I did it to ensure." The rest of his sentence was swallowed by the sudden, muffled thump of a window breaching in the master suite. The pressurized seal of the penthouse had been broken. Before Zora could scream, Dae-Hyun was a blur of motion, lunging across the room to tackle her behind the heavy velvet sofa, just as a volley of suppressed gunfire shredded the air where she had been standing. "The council," Dae-Hyun hissed, pulling a handgun from a hidden holster beneath the coffee table. "They aren't waiting for a negotiation." Two men in matte black tactical gear vaulted over the balcony, their movements professional and synchronized. They weren't there to kill, they moved with the intent to capture. They wanted the ledger, and they knew exactly which body it was hidden in. Dae-Hyun fired, catching the first man in the shoulder, but the second assassin deployed a flashbang. The world turned into a blinding, white roar. Zora felt the floor drop out from under her, her medical instincts screaming through the panic. She saw Dae-Hyun struggle to rise, his vision blurred, his movements sluggish from the concussive force. One of the assassins lunged for her, reaching for the very collarbone that held the chip. Zora didn't scramble away. Instead, she leaned into the attacker's reach. In her hand was a pressurized canister of sevoflurane, a potent inhalation anesthetic she had taken from the clinic, and a surgical syringe filled with a concentrated neuromuscular blocker. As the man grabbed her arm, Zora drove her thumb into the carotid sinus. A specific pressure, point at the fork of the carotid artery. The sudden stimulation caused his heart rate to plummet and his blood pressure to drop instantly, a reflex known as carotid sinus syncope. As he stumbled, Zora pressed the canister's nozzle directly beneath his tactical mask. The sweet, chemical scent of the gas filled the air. Within seconds, the assassin's grip loosened, his nervous system bypassed by a dose of sleep he hadn't prepared for. "Dae-Hyun, left side," Zora shouted, ducking as another shadow loomed over her. Dae-Hyun, recovering his senses, used the sofa as a springboard, launching himself at the second attacker. But the man was larger, a brute who pinned Dae-Hyun against the glass wall. Zora saw the man's hand go for a combat knife. She didn't hesitate. She scrambled across the floor, driving the syringe into the large muscle of the attacker's thigh. "Succinylcholine," she whispered, her voice shaking but her hands precise. The drug worked with terrifying speed. The assassin's muscles began to fasciculate, small, involuntary twitches rippling under his skin, before they went completely limp. It was a total paralysis of the skeletal muscles. He collapsed like a puppet with its strings cut, his eyes wide and terrified, fully conscious, but unable to move even a finger to finish his kill. Dae-Hyun stood over the fallen men, his chest heaving, his eyes darting to Zora. He looked at the syringe in her hand, then at the two elite soldiers she had neutralized with nothing but biology and nerves. For the first time, he saw her not as the woman he needed to protect, but as the only person capable of keeping him alive. "We have to go," he said, his voice thick with a mix of shame and awe. "The perimeter is gone. They know the ledger is active." Zora stood up, wiping a smear of soot from her forehead. She looked at the man she loved, the man who had turned her into a target. "We're going," she agreed, her voice hard as diamond. "But we're doing this my way. No more ghosts, Dae-Hyun. From now on, the dragon follows the doctor." The private jet banked sharply over the dark, churning waters of the Korea Strait, the lights of Jeju Island appearing as a jagged emerald necklace against the black velvet of the sea. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was suffocating, thick with the smell of copper and the electric hum of the plane's medical monitors. Dae-Hyun sat in a leather captain's chair, his face a mask of sweating marble. He hadn't spoken since they cleared New York airspace, his gaze fixed on a point in space that only he could see. Zora knelt at his feet, her hands moving over his legs with a frantic, clinical rhythm. "Dae-Hyun, I need you to push back, just a little. Give me a sign that the signals are still reaching your motor cortex." He didn't move. He couldn't. The trauma of the penthouse breach had acted like a master switch, flipping his nervous system back into the frozen state that had defined his life for 5 years. It was the ultimate betrayal of his own mind, a psychosomatic collapse triggered by the sudden, violent return of the world he thought he had escaped. The secret spot on his abdomen, the old injury site that had been the epicenter of his healing, was now throbbing with a phantom pain that bypassed all medication. "It's happening again," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "The ice! Zora, it's coming up from my feet. I can't feel the floor." "It's a conversion disorder, Dae-Hyun. Your brain is trying to protect you from the stress by shutting down the machinery," Zora explained, her voice forced into a calm she didn't feel. She knew the science. Under extreme emotional duress, the amygdala can override the motor pathways, creating a physical paralysis that is very real to the patient despite the lack of a new physical injury. She watched the needle on his heart rate monitor climb. They were landing in 10 minutes at a private airstrip on the southern tip of the island, a fortress disguised as a luxury villa. But a fortress was a tomb if its king couldn't stand. As the wheels touched down with a jarring thud, Dae-Hyun's head fell back against the headrest. His breathing was shallow, his pupils blown wide with a primal, paralyzed terror. The ghost dragon was gone, replaced by the broken man she had met in that Seoul penthouse months ago. "They're waiting for us at the villa, aren't they?" Zora asked as she signaled for the transport team. "The Elder Council. They have eyes everywhere," Dae-Hyun managed to choke out. "If they see me like this, they won't even negotiate, they'll just harvest." Zora's blood ran cold. She knew what he meant. They didn't need Dae-Hyun alive, they just needed the chip inside her and the key that was coded to his unique neural signature. If he couldn't function, they would take what they wanted from both of them with a scalpel. She leaned in close, her lips brushing his ear, her hand pressing firmly against the secret spot to ground him. "Listen to me. I didn't pull you out of the darkness just to let you slide back in. We are going into that villa, and you are going to hold your head high, even if I have to be the one holding up your heart. The ice doesn't win today." The cabin door hissed open, admitting the humid, salt-tinged air of Jeju. Two of Dae-Hyun's most loyal remaining men stood at the bottom of the ramp, their faces grim. Zora didn't wait for them to help. She draped Dae-Hyun's heavy, limp arm over her shoulder, her knees buckling for a moment under his weight, and began the agonizing process of dragging her king toward a sanctuary that felt more like a trap. The dragon had fallen, and as the humid night swallowed them, Zora realized she wasn't just his nurse or his lover anymore. She was his only armor in a world that had finally scented his weakness. The subterranean medical bunker beneath the Jeju villa was a cathedral of cold steel and flickering monitors, a stark contrast to the tropical warmth of the island above. Dae-Hyun lay strapped to a reclining biomechanical chair, his body as rigid as a tombstone. The psychosomatic paralysis had reached his diaphragm, making every breath a shallow, hitching struggle. Outside, the perimeter sensors were already screaming. The Elder Council's fleet was moving in, silent as sharks in the moonlit water. Dae-Hyun, look at me, Zora commanded, her voice cutting through the hum of the cooling fans. She was holding 2 specialized electrodes, wired to an experimental neurostimulator she had smuggled from her New York clinic. Your brain has locked the gates. I have to blow them open. This isn't going to feel like healing. It's going to feel like fire. He couldn't nod. He could only stare at her with eyes full of a drowning man's desperation. Zora positioned the first probe at the base of his skull and the second directly over the secret spot on his abdomen, the scarred epicenter of his trauma. I'm increasing the frequency, she whispered, her hand hovering over the dial. I need your nervous system to override the fear block. I need you to scream if you have to, but please don't stop fighting to find my hand. She thumbed the switch. A jagged arc of high-frequency electricity surged through Dae-Hyun's frame. His back arched violently, his muscles seizing in a forced tetanic contraction. A guttural, primal sound tore from his throat, a cry of pure, unadulterated agony as the machine forced his dormant nerves to fire. Again, Zora cried, tears blurring her vision as she watched the man she loved writhe under the artificial lightning. On the monitor, the flat line of his motor-evoked potentials began to spike into chaotic, jagged mountains. She was essentially jump-starting his soul. The pain was the only thing sharp enough to pierce the thick ice of his conversion disorder. She saw his fingers twitch, not a reflex, but a conscious, agonized clawing at the air. Zora, stop, he gasped, the words barely audible over the crackle of the electrodes. I can't, she sobbed, pushing the dial into the red. If I stop now, the gates will permanently close. Stay with me. Feel the pain, Dae-Hyun, use it. The bunker shook as the first of the council's breaching charges detonated at the villa's upper gates. The ceiling dusted them with white plaster. They were out of time. Zora leaned over him, her face inches from his, the smell of ozone and sweat filling the narrow space. She grabbed his hand, pressing her palm against his. Find me, Dae-Hyun. Break the ice or we die here. With a final, explosive surge of current, Dae-Hyun's eyes flew open, the pupils constricting with a sudden, lethal focus. His hand suddenly clamped onto hers with a bone-crushing grip. The paralysis didn't just fade, it shattered. He sat bolt upright, ripping the electrodes from his skin, his chest heaving as the ghost dragon roared back to life within the shell of the broken man. The door to the bunker groaned under the weight of a thermal cutter. Dae-Hyun stood, his legs trembling but holding, his gaze settling on the rack of tactical gear in the corner. He looked at Zora, the pain still radiating through his limbs, but the frozen stare was gone. The fire worked, he said, his voice dropping into that terrifying, melodic vibration of the high-ranking predator. He reached out, his thumb catching a tear on her cheek. Now, give me the syringe. I have a debt to settle before the sun rises. Zora handed him the adrenaline auto-injector, her heart racing. The healer had done her job. She had awakened the monster to save the man. As the bunker door began to glow red from the outside heat, she knew the sanctuary was gone. The dragon was awake, and he was hungry. The smell of ozone from the neurostimulator was quickly replaced by the acrid stench of melting thermite. The bunker door didn't just open, it disintegrated. Before the smoke could clear, a wave of Elder Council enforcers flooded the room. Dae-Hyun, still reeling from the shock of his forced awakening, managed to neutralize the first 2 with a brutal, visceral efficiency, but his legs, still weak from the paralysis, betrayed him. He stumbled, and in that split second of vulnerability, a heavy rifle butt slammed into Zora's temple. The world went black. When Zora woke, she wasn't in the bunker. She was in the villa's grand hall, bathed in the sickly gold light of a dozen chandeliers. She was bound to a high-backed chair, her head throbbing in time with her heartbeat. Opposite her, Dae-Hyun was knelt on the floor, his arms held back by thick chains, his face a map of bruises and defiance. Standing between them was Elder Park, a man whose skin looked like yellowed parchment and whose eyes held the cold vacuum of a century of cruelty. On a mahogany side table sat Zora's medical kit, her scalpels and chemical vials arranged with terrifying neatness. "The ghost dragon has become quite a nuisance, Dr. Sterling," Elder Park said, his voice a dry whisper like dead leaves skittering on stone. "A man with a heart is a man who cannot be controlled, and we require a controller for the territories he abandoned." "He's a human being, not a weapon," Zora spat, the metallic taste of blood in her mouth. The elder ignored her, picking up a specialized neurosurgical probe from her kit. "You have performed miracles on his nervous system. You found the secret spot that unfroze him. Now you will use that same knowledge to do the opposite. You will perform a deep brain stimulation, a total reset of his limbic system." Zora's stomach turned. He was asking for a chemical and electrical lobotomy. By targeting the amygdala and the hippocampus with a specific cocktail of neurotoxins, she could effectively erase his personality, his memories of her, and his capacity for independent will. She would turn the man she loved into a biological drone, a lethal, mindless puppet for the council. "If you refuse," Elder Park continued, leaning in close so she could smell the peppermint he used to mask the scent of decay, "we will not kill him. We will simply peel the ledger out of your collarbone while you are still awake to watch. And then we will let him watch you bleed out, knowing he was too weak to move a finger to save you." Dae-Hyun looked up, his eyes locking onto Zora's. Even through the blood and the pain, his gaze was steady. "Do it, Zora," he rasped. "Better a puppet than a corpse, save yourself." But Zora saw the tiny, almost imperceptible flick of his finger, a signal they had practiced during their long hours of physical therapy. He wasn't giving up, he was giving her an opening. "The procedure requires a high concentration of norepinephrine to keep the heart from failing during the reset," Zora said, her voice dropping into a flat, professional tone that hid the frantic racing of her heart. The elder smiled, a ghastly expression. "Proceed, your kit is ready." They untied her hands but kept a gun pressed to her ribs. Zora approached Dae-Hyun, her fingers trembling as she prepared the syringe. To the council, it looked like she was preparing the reset serum. In reality, she was calculatedly mixing a lethal dose of stimulants, a cocktail designed to put his body into a state of hyperarousal, a temporary chemical berserker mode. As she leaned over him, her hair shielding her face from the elder's view, she whispered the words that had become their private vow. "This is going to hurt more than the fire, Dae-Hyun. Please, don't stop until the room is empty." She drove the needle deep into the muscle of his neck. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, Dae-Hyun's pupils didn't just constrict, they vanished into a void of pure adrenaline. The betrayal of the nurse was complete, not against her lover, but against the monsters who thought they could own him. The syringe hissed as Zora emptied the concentrated chemical cocktail into Dae-Hyun's jugular. To the elder council members watching with predatory curiosity, it looked like the final surrender, the nurse breaking her patient to save her own skin. Dae-Hyun's head slumped forward, his body going unnaturally still, mimicking the profound neural depression of a successful lobotomy. "The limbic reset is complete," Zora whispered, her voice hollow and trembling. She stepped back, her hands tucked into the pockets of her white coat, her fingers curling around a scalpel she had palmed from the tray. "He is yours now, a blank slate." Elder Park stepped forward, a triumphant sneer curling his thin lips. He reached out a gnarled hand to lift Dae-Hyun's chin, wanting to gloat into the empty eyes of his new puppet. "Finally," the old man rasped, "the dragon is tamed." But as the elder's fingers touched his skin, Dae-Hyun's eyes snapped open. They weren't empty. They were twin vortices of hyperadrenalized fury. The norepinephrine and stimulant cocktail was a chemical forge, melting the last of his psychosomatic shackles and pushing his heart rate into a zone that would have killed a lesser man. The reset was a lie. Zora had given him a 60-minute window of absolute, uninhibited lethality. With a sound that was less a human cry and more a mechanical roar of snapping steel, Dae-Hyun didn't just break the chains. He used the momentum of the failing metal to swing his weight upward. His first strike was a blur, a palm heel strike to Elder Park's throat that collapsed the old man's windpipe before he could even register the betrayal. The room erupted. Enforcers reached for their sidearms, but Dae-Hyun was already among them. He moved with a terrifying, jagged speed, his perception of time slowed by the chemical surge. To him, the guards were moving through molasses. He didn't fight like a man. He fought like a force of nature, using the tactical knowledge of a kingpin and the raw, desperate strength of a man who had everything to lose. Zora dove behind the mahogany table as a stray bullet shattered a vase above her head. She watched, her heart hammering against her ribs, as Dae-Hyun bypassed every defensive reflex the guards possessed. He was targeting nerve clusters and pressure points with surgical precision, knowledge he had absorbed from her during their countless hours of physical therapy. Dae-Hyun, the door, she screamed as a second wave of guards began to breach the hall. He spun, catching a discarded submachine gun in midair. He didn't fire blindly. His focus was a singular, burning point of light. He cleared the doorway in a focused burst of violence, then turned back to Zora. His skin was flushed, his veins standing out like cords of iron under the dragon ink on his neck. The secret spot on his abdomen was tight, the muscles there finally fully functional, acting as the core for his explosive movements. He reached her in 3 strides, hauling her to her feet with a grip that vibrated with a terrifying energy. "The stairs," he rasped, his voice sounding like grinding gravel. "The car is in the lower bay. We have 40 minutes before the crash hits." Zora knew the science better than anyone. When this chemical high ended, the crash wouldn't just be exhaustion, it would be a total systemic collapse. His heart was currently a ticking time bomb. "I'm with you," she said, grabbing his arm to steady him as the first tremors of the drug's side effects began to rattle his frame. They ran through the burning villa, the ghost dragon carving a path of fire through his former masters. Behind them, the Elder Council's empire was screaming, but ahead of them, the path was stained with the blood of their enemies. Zora realized then that they were no longer a nurse and a patient fleeing a tragedy. They were a weapon and its architect, finally ready to take back the night. The black-armored SUV screeched to a halt in front of the council's headquarters, a brutalist monolith of black granite that sat like a tomb in the heart of Seoul's forbidden district. Dae-Hyun stumbled out of the driver's seat, his movements twitchy and frantic, the adrenaline Zora had injected still surging through his veins like liquid fire. He had less than 20 minutes before his heart gave out, and he looked every bit the dying god. "Give me the terminal," he rasped, his eyes bloodshot as he handed Zora a tactical tablet synced to the chip beneath her skin. Zora's fingers flew over the screen, her medical precision pivoting into a different kind of surgery. As they breached the lobby, the air was thick with the scent of gunsmoke and expensive cologne. The council's remaining elite stood in a defensive circle around a central server hub, but Dae-Hyun didn't give them a chance to negotiate. He moved through the room like a ghost made of blades, his secret spot, the core of his strength, vibrating with every explosive strike. As Dae-Hyun cleared a path, Zora tapped into the biolink. The chip in her collarbone hummed, the microscopic drive releasing the dragon's ledger. The tablet's screen lit up with names that made the world's stock markets tremble. Senators, tech moguls, and generals. It was a digital map of global corruption, all tied back to the Elder Council's bank accounts. "Stop!" the last remaining council member screamed, his voice cracking as Dae-Hyun pinned him to the server rack. "If you leak that, the world burns." "Then let it burn," Zora whispered, her voice echoing through the comms. She hit the broadcast button. "I'm not a nurse today, I'm the one signing your death certificates." The data began to upload in real time to every major news outlet and regulatory agency in the hemisphere. On the wall-mounted monitors, they watched as the council's untouchable status dissolved. Bank accounts froze, arrest warrants were issued by automated legal systems, and the global elite scrambled to distance themselves from the stench of the falling dragon. Dae-Hyun let the council member fall to the floor, the man's power stripped away by a series of ones and zeros. The ghost dragon turned to Zora, his breathing coming in ragged, wet gasps. The chemical high was fatting. His eyes began to roll back as his blood pressure plummeted, the crash finally arriving with the force of a tidal wave. "Zora," he choked out, his knees buckling. She dropped the tablet and caught him before his head hit the granite. The room was silent now, the sirens in the distance coming not for them, but for the men they had just destroyed. Zora pressed her hand against his chest, feeling the terrifying, erratic skip of his heart. "I've got you," she cried, pulling a final vial from her pocket, the antidote to the stimulant. "The ledger is out, Dae-Hyun. The world knows. Now please don't stop beating. We're finally free." She plunged the needle into his chest, her eyes fixed on his. In the heart of the enemy's fortress, surrounded by the ruins of an empire, the nurse and her patient waited for the first beat of a new life. The skyline of Seoul was no longer a jagged threat to Han Dae-Hyun. It was a patient under his care. 6 months after the fall of the Elder Council, the black granite monolith that once served as the heart of the underworld had been gutted and reborn. It was now the Sterling Park Institute, a gleaming sanctuary of glass and greenery, where the city's forgotten souls, the orphans, the wounded laborers, and the victims of the Syndicate's decades of greed, received the world-class care they had long been denied. Zora Sterling stood on the observation deck of the top floor, her white coat catching the soft light of the rising sun. The secret spot beneath her collarbone was gone, replaced by a thin, silvery scar where the ledger had been surgically removed. The data it contained had dismantled 100 corrupt empires, but the wealth it unlocked had been diverted into a new kind of power, the power to restore. She heard the familiar, steady rhythm of footsteps behind her. They weren't the silent, predatory glides of a ghost dragon, but the firm, grounded steps of a man who finally owned his own body. Dae-Hyun stopped beside her, leaning his forearms on the railing. He looked younger, the lethal tension that had once defined his jawline replaced by a quiet, watchful peace. He wore no suit today, just a simple linen shirt that revealed the faded ink of the dragon on his arm, a dragon that now seemed to sleep. "The clinic in the Mapo district opened its doors an hour ago," Dae-Hyun said, his voice a warm vibration in the morning air. "The waitlist is already a mile long. It turns out, when you stop bleeding a city dry, it starts to grow back pretty quickly." Zora smiled, reaching out to take his hand. His grip was strong, his pulse steady and rhythmic against her palm. "You've spent your whole life being a ghost, Dae-Hyun. How does it feel to be a neighbor?" "It feels heavy," he admitted, turning to look at her with eyes that were finally clear of the chemical haze and the frozen trauma of the past. "But it's a weight I like carrying. For the first time, I don't have to look at my hands and wonder whose blood is on them. I only see the work we've done." They weren't civilians in the traditional sense. The city still whispered their names with a mix of awe and fear. They were the healers of the city, a legendary duo that operated in the gray space where the law was too slow and the streets were too cruel. They held the keys to the city's secrets, but instead of using them to lock doors, they used them to open wards and build futures. Dae-Hyun pulled her closer, his forehead resting against hers. The secret spot on his abdomen no longer throbbed with phantom pain. It was just a mark of a life lived, a reminder of the woman who had dared to touch a monster until he became a man. "I used to think the dragon's vow was about protecting you from the world," he whispered, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "But you taught me that the real vow was protecting the world from the dragon. Thank you for not stopping, Zora, even when I begged you to." Zora leaned into him, the hum of the awakening city below them sounding like a heartbeat. The war was over, the ledger was closed, and the healer's kingdom had finally begun. In the center of Seoul, where the shadows used to rule, 2 people who had once been broken stood whole, proving that even the deepest scars can become the strongest parts of the soul.